Syphilis, cataracts, and diabetes. This is what museums don't want you to know. Hey, history heroes! I'm Tempest, a public historian and museum interpretation specialist, and today we're going to be discussing how Impressionism and some of its greatest works of art wouldn't have been possible without the movement's leading artists adapting their style to their disabilities, and why most museums don't want you to know about it. But first, let's do a quick intro on Impressionism. Impressionism is an artistic movement that started in the 1860s, breaking away from a more traditional style into bolder brushstrokes, a greater emphasis on natural light, and realistic scenes of landscapes and ordinary people. The first group exhibition of Impressionist artists we're familiar with today was in 1874 in Paris, featuring Monet, Renoir, and more. Although not well received, the artists persevered in their art, carving out a new style of painting and therefore artistic movement. Or at least, that's the straight and narrow narrative that art historians and posh museums want you to believe. The truth is, it's far more complicated. While Impressionists were experimental and willing to break the confines of the traditional art crowd, by the time of the exhibition, some of the artists weren't just inventing their new style, they were adapting it to their disabilities. Even before that first exhibition in 1874, Paul Cézanne was severely nearsighted and reportedly didn't like wearing glasses, which shaped his work into a signature style with sharp detail up close and hazy features in the distance. This may have been developed further by his diabetic retinopathy later in life. Edgar Degas was already using glasses in 1874, being described that same year as sickly and as being deeply concerned about the possibility of losing his eyesight, now thought to be a degenerative retinal disease that affected his central vision and perception of light. His work went from this to this around 15 years later. The light, detail, and color have faded and become hazy like his vision, which eventually failed him almost entirely. But even with only a flicker of sight remaining, he adapted and began experimenting with bold pastels and his now famous sculptures. In 1875, Édouard Manet, who was previously mostly known for realism, began experiencing extreme leg pain, followed by loss of coordination and muscle weakness. As a result, he adapted to working on smaller canvases, which naturally caused him to transition away from the large traditional scenes in his previous work to more intimate, vibrant subjects. Given his coordination difficulties, the pain distracting him, and the possible mental struggles due to his late-stage syphilis, his brushwork became looser, adding to his unique style. And it's the reason why we have iconic paintings, like a bar at the 𝐓𝐢𝐩𝐬. Later, in the 1880s, Camille Pissarro began suffering from a chronic eye infection that was aggravated by working outdoors. While it didn't have much of an effect on his technique, it did cause him to shift to working indoors, painting what he saw outside windows and balconies. The result was a stunning array of later work depicting the expansive cityscapes of Paris, Rouen, and more. But it's the most famous Impressionists that had perhaps the most impactful adaptations that shaped their iconic work. Pierre-Auguste Renoir had an incredibly prolific career, spanning almost 6 decades, producing thousands of work that can be found in almost every major museum around the world. But around 1892, he developed rheumatoid arthritis. This caused him severe pain, and over time, his joints became stiff and deformed. His right shoulder, wrists, and elbows were barely mobile due to the inflammation. His hands were rigid and swollen, and eventually, he could no longer walk or stand. Yet Renoir refused to give up and began adapting his techniques to his abilities. He had his son or a nurse bandage his hands to prevent painful lesions from forming, and placed a brush into his hand as he could no longer pick one up. And when he could no longer stand, he used a wheelchair with his pallet attached to it, with a blanket draped over him and cats in his lap to warm his aching body. From these adaptations, a new world of artistic possibilities emerged, with softer, dreamlike features and an ease about his lines. His color palette became brighter and more dazzling than ever, with an almost renewed sense of wonder of the world around him. Renoir himself admitted that this was because he poured all his remaining energy into his canvas, freeing himself from having to worry about his mobility. When you think of famous works of art, chances are one of the first images that springs to mind is a painting from Claude Monet's Water Lily series, which began in 1897 and continued until his death in 1926. The earliest paintings are vivid, with detailed reflections, varied textures, a sense of depth, and realistic light. But as the series progresses, the reflections become more simplistic, with increasingly abstract brushstrokes, dim colors, and an almost hazy film over the scene. Similarly, other subjects became equally distorted. That's because Monet was going blind from cataracts. Starting in 1908, he began to complain of vision issues, until finally traveling to London in 1913 for a consultation with a renowned ophthalmologist. He was prescribed new glasses, and while the doctor recommended surgery on his right eye, he refused. But things only got worse. He adapted labeling his paint and keeping them in a strict order as to not mix them up. This continued until 1923, when he finally agreed to have surgery on his right eye, which by then could barely perceive any light. Recovery was difficult, and he struggled to adjust to his new glasses, while also struggling mentally upon realizing his work had increasingly strange colors. In his frustration, he ended up destroying some of his canvases. Thankfully, by 1925, his condition had improved, though the left lens in his glasses had to be blacked out. With his right eye doing the heavy lifting, he resumed painting, and even touched up some of his earlier work, guided by his friends and family, before dying at the age of 86 in 1926. But wait a minute. If all these leading artists of the Impressionist era adapted their techniques due to their disabilities, enough to visually change their work, why aren't museums telling you about it? Well, the first reason is that there's an automatic assumption that people are non-disabled. And if that assumption is challenged, there's often discomfort when discussing disabilities, especially if those involved in the conversation are not disabled themselves. But without that discourse and representation, we're missing out on so much context within art history. The second reason is that museums and curators are slow to changing with the times. Historically, the trend among labels and exhibition narratives is to remove the art from the artist, focusing on technique and superficial information, without regard to the lived experience of the artist, even when it's one of the biggest influences on the creation of their art. They also often operate under the assumption that visitors already have a prior knowledge of art history that comes from access to higher education. And all of this feeds into how museums cultivate and maintain an air of elitism, placing artists way up on a mysterious pedestal to reinforce how they're artistic geniuses, because they assume that people wouldn't come to see an ordinary person's art. But are they geniuses for developing a new way of painting, or for devising a new way of adapting their painting to their abilities? Why can't it be both? Though the disabilities of these artists did not create the Impressionist movement, their determination and their adaptation shaped it, and as a result, produced some of the greatest art this world has ever seen. And that is something that should be celebrated. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe for more hidden history, and as always, stay curious, history heroes.